backing up just slightly, what what affects calcification? A lot of things affect calcification. Suffice to say, there is no, there is no single silver bullet. There are a ton of different things. Lighting's going to affect it. Chemistry in various carbonate chemistry in various ways is going to affect it. Feeding's going to affect it. That sort of thing. So in general, at least within reason, for the kinds of chemistries that we're typically using in reef tanks, higher alkalinity is certainly going to increase your calcification. Inorganic carbon, it tends to be limiting to calcification for corals and other organisms.
So dirty water.
Dirty water?
Basically dirty water.
Yeah. But also that makes me think of Sanjay's adding the ammonia.
That's a whole different. Okay,
we're gonna break Chris's brain.
Let me get into nutrients in a second.
Yeah.
Higher alkalinity is gonna generally promote higher calcification, higher pH within reason. I'm assuming all these things are within reason. Is going to promote higher calcification, although maybe not as much as we have often thought. And I'll just little spoiler, some of the recent work that I've done and folks in our group have done looking at effects of ocean acidification on corals and bazillions of other critters. We actually saw very small effects of acidification, a 0.2 pH unit reduction. So going from like a pH of 8.1 to 7.9 on NBS scale. We use the total hydrogen ion scale, but don't worry about it. It's like Celsius versus Fahrenheit. So in general, those things are going to promote higher calcification. Higher calcium probably will too, although it's likely going to have kind of diminishing returns because there's so much calcium in seawater as compared to the amount of alkalinity. So
it sounds like all of these things are kind of the same. pH has some effect, but there's no reason to boost your tank to 8.6 because it's not the only thing that's affecting. You don't need to bring your alkalinity to 12. You don't need to do all that because all these things work together and changing one doesn't matter. And furthermore, it's like being at a buffet doesn't mean you're really going to eat more because there's more food available. Means there's just more food sitting there. It's not really converting to muscle.
Yep. No, fair enough.
Maybe.
Yeah. No. I think that's a reasonable analogy. In general, higher of those things is going to help. But yeah, if you were to say raise the pH of your tank to 8.6, really realistically, about the only way to do that is to use a very high pH additive, kalkwasser. Maybe sodium carbonate.
People are doing it.
Yeah, and what you're going to get very quickly is a snowstorm that made everything a lot worse than it was if you had just run a pH of like 8.3.
Just because you're trying to redline it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But and what your new research, I don't want to put you on the spot of saying something that's not published, but the two,
some of this is out, so it's good.
Going up 0.2 pH doesn't actually get you the kick that you might think it does.
It was not a huge effect. And here we're actually going down in pH, so looking at acidification, but same principle. It's not that there was no effect. The effect varied by species, but it wasn't very big. Even for the species that were most sensitive, it wasn't a huge effect. And for one of them, we actually saw higher calcification under lower pH, which was a bit surprising.
Is it possible to say a percentage of when you say not a very big effect? People understand percentages, so I try to go to that.
For most of them, less than 10%.
Less than 10, yeah. Okay, so who cares? Sorry, Ben,
Chris,
go ahead.
But Chris, also, I want to make this distinction too, because you're talking about like 0.2 pH. Well, then, what screams to me is that us hobbyists are using like sort of crappy methods to test pH at best, whereas you're probably using like YSI or some other like really expensive equipment.
So our $10,000 YSI, I
Yep.
trust.
Oh, boom, nailed it.
So our $10,000 YSI with $1,200 pH probe,
Woo!
I trust for a ballpark, not for accurate.
Yeah.
And that's much better equipment than
And
what
we're using $100 things.
exactly. So the way that we actually use this, and I do use the YSI quite regularly. It's great for ballpark. It's great when I'm making little adjustments to tweak the water chemistry in a tank. It's useful for that. It's about 10 times more accurate and precise than what you're gonna get in a hobbyist grade electrode, but using a spectrophotometric method. It's basically, like color change pH indicators, but using a good spectrophotometer and
Titration. Yeah.
um, uh, that, that we can measure this very, very precisely. So just for ballpark, with a hobbyist grade pH electrode, if it's freshly calibrated, because all of them lose their calibration over time. I think oftentimes people, when they get wonky pH values, like their tank is reading 8.6 or 8.8, and they haven't added any kalkwasser or anything, that's because the calibration of your pH probe is crap. It's just off. But anyway, hibiscus grade electrodes, you're probably going to be accurate to within plus or minus 0.1. So if it says it's 8.0, it might actually be 8.1. It might actually be 7.9.
But in Chris, that's why I think it's so insane that hobbyists try to redline numbers with equipment that aren't going to accurately reflect what's going on, when it's just like, quit trying to redline those numbers and just, look at the variability of your testing methods and just get in the ballpark and quit freaking out about trying to be as accurate as you cannot be.
Right. Yeah. No, if you're running and skipping around at the edge of a cliff all the time, eventually you're going to trip and fall.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's fucking beautiful. That's fucking beautiful. Listen, this is so far been the most Reef Beef of a Reef Beef episode. This is literally hanging out with Chris and going, "Hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this?" So I want to get to your research, and we've gone all over the place, wonderfully, I think. What on the calcification, the alkalinity? What have we missed? Anything that you think hobbyists should know that you remember?
Yeah, so I guess I'll stress a few things. Measure and adjust. That's the only thing that works. I would not, as we were just discussing, I would not try to push things to the very, very edge, because if you're at the very, very edge with everything, eventually you're going to fall over the edge.
Yeah,
and something real bad's going to happen. So good enough is usually good enough.
That's my saying. That's my saying.
Wonderful. Higher alkalinity within reason is going to be a good thing for calcification by your corals, coral and algae, other things. Moderate yes.
What do you consider
yes, in the back?
That's the same question. You ask it, Ben.
Yeah.
Ask it, Ben.
Yeah. What do you I generally stay in the 8s, but in my experience, when I get to 12, a lot of different corals will look a little pissed. So maybe you're saying like 9 to 11, 9 to 10.
So natural seawater at a salinity of 35,
7.
because if you change the salinity, you change how much of these salts are dissolved in it. But natural seawater alkalinities, it's like 6.2 or something, a little over 6. It's a little over 6. In practice, though, it can be as low as 5 in an area that gets a lot of freshwater runoff and the salinity is low. It could be as high as 7 in the Red Sea with super high salinity. So that's what's natural. And we have abundant evidence that higher than natural tends to be effective. So usually, if it were me, and I'm just going to speak for myself, what has worked really well for me, I mean, in my work, I'm just using natural seawater. But what has worked really effectively for me in tanks is at least 7, not higher than 12. Somewhere in that range has worked really well for me. And yeah, if you have an observation like when I get to 12, some of the corals look pissed off, well, don't do that then.
Yeah. But I think some people might think like, oh my God, if I go from 8 to 10, I'm going to kill something, or, like a wandering pH. But I think there's more wiggle room with alkalinity there.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a fair amount of wiggle room with all the stuff. If they could not, if any of these organisms could not tolerate, differences in these parameters, they really wouldn't be doing well in the ocean.
Yeah.
So, we can achieve very different chemistries in our tanks as compared to what exists in the ocean. And my take on it is what's natural is a good starting point. It's a good default. If we don't have reasons, good reasons to deviate from what is natural, cool, just go with it because we know it works. But when we do have good reasons to deviate from what's natural, well, we have good reasons to do that then. We know that higher alkalinity is going to boost coral calcification, and oftentimes by a decent amount for like a large change. So going from like a DKH of 6 to 7, you're probably not going to notice much. But going from like 6 to 10 or even slightly higher, that is going to have, for most species, a pretty substantial effect. And there we're not talking like 10%. It might boost your calcification 50%, 70%.
Okay.
So, with those sorts of changes. Calcium, on the other hand, and also keep in mind, these are all, we should consider the proportional changes. So sometimes folks will say, oh, slightly making this up, but not entirely, bolus method. But let's say, 430 parts per million for calcium is considered good, whereas 440, now that's a problem. You don't want to exceed that. Bullshit. That's like a few percent difference. There is no threshold. No. But there's so much calcium in seawater, boosting it much higher than natural seawater levels is probably not going to help much. pH, I would shoot for within reason, 8 to 8.4. But even if it's a bit lower than that, say you're running a calcium reactor, you could certainly make up for a fairly large discrepancy in pH, like say 8.3 versus 7.8 or 9, something like that, by just boosting your alkalinity up a few DKH.
Okay, so I think we're getting into the part of where it's like, when somebody says I boosted my whatever and everything's doing better, I always think, but that's also got to do with everything else that's been chugging along till this point. Everything's maturing and settling in and adapting to the current conditions. So it's not necessarily, this is what makes all of this so difficult to pinpoint, is the systems are so dynamic. But the one thing I'm taking away from this is, I've been running between 8 and 9 DKH. And I recently bumped it up to like 9.3, 9.4. I might bump that up just a little bit more because you said some magic words about alkalinity, but I'm not going back. I'm not going back to 12 ever again. That was just ridiculous. But putting up my threshold to 9.8 seems, from 8.8 to 9.8 instead of 8.1 to 9.1 seems like it may be worth it. But that's a small risk that I'm taking there. and it's also an easy thing, and it's not redlining anything. So I'm comfortable with it, and I don't expect magic. But it seems easy enough to do, so why not? But that's different than going, Chris said more alkaline is better, so I'm going to 13, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll say with that, within there are multiple components within the carbonate system, and something we always certainly want to avoid is a bunch of abiotic precipitation of carbonates, causing a snowstorm or getting a bunch of precipitation in sand or on pumps or something like that. Just, bad things happen. And also it just becomes a huge pain to constantly be cleaning pumps and whatnot. Sure. So it's not, for all of these parameters, there is no threshold where magic happens. You increase the calcium, eventually you're going to reach a point where you're getting increased abiotic precipitation, but you would have to increase calcium so freaking much. Practically speaking, it's not going to happen. If you go from 400 to 800, which no one's going to run their tank at 800 parts per million calcium, you've doubled it. If you go from 6 DKH to 12 DKH, you have doubled the alkalinity. If you change the pH by 0.3 units, you are reducing the hydrogen ion concentration by half, or double. Yeah, by half. So
okay.
Anyway, it's multiple interacting parameters. Yeah, and like we were saying, if you're trying to push everything to the edge, it's eventually going to go bad.
Okay.
I mean, and you can say, since we love analogies, I've been thinking about this while you've been talking, is calcification is like a vehicle, and there's a lot of things that make the vehicle run. Like you could pull out the fuel pump, you could do this, you could do that. There's things you could rip out, the vehicle would still go, just not very effectively and not as far. But there's a lot going on that makes your vehicle go down the road.
That's a great freaking analogy, Ben.
Absolutely. Gold star.
Gold star. You can move up one row.
I didn't even go to college.
We know. That's clear. Thanks so much, man.